Welcome to the Alphagenix Podcast, where every week we talk to incredible guests from around the world of biohacking, well-being, men's health, and more. Here's your host, co-founder of Alphagenix, Ross Tomkins.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome today's guest, all the way from the other side of the world, Dr. Jill Carnahan. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I came across your work last year and absolutely loved your book, Unexpected. But for anyone who hasn't heard of you or come across your work before, I guess, what's your origin story? Where did all of this come from? Where's your passion come from?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ross. It's a delight to be here and talk to you today. So I grew up on a farm in Illinois, right in the smack dab of the U.S., farm country, corn and soybeans. I was one of 5 children. So big farm family, Midwestern values, which for those of you who maybe don't know what that is, it's like hard work, and more hard work, which is great, right? It creates a kind of successful entrepreneurial mindset. But part of my unlearning was how to rest and how to restore and how to take care of myself. But anyway, grew up on a farm, amazing family, great situation. Never in a million years thought I would go into medicine, but I kind of had the heart of a healer. And I grew up with like a chiropractor and some more natural types of healers that were in my life as, caregivers. We went to the doctor as kids, and my mother was a retired nurse. So it wasn't like we didn't use the medical system, but I definitely had the idea that food can heal. We had a garden, and that if you live well, you may not have to go to the doctor every season and that kind of thing. So I had this idea that there were other things besides just medications that could heal our bodies. And then as I started applying to different types of schools and things, I realized, I might as well apply to traditional medical school. As I started getting interviews and then some acceptance letters, I thought, well, maybe I could go into medicine and actually infiltrate the realm of the U.S. conventional medical system, which is a great system, best reimbursed system, but really still relies heavily on drugs and surgery versus like, how do we actually heal and overcome illness? But unbeknownst to me, part of my upbringing on the farm had led to a lot of toxic load and chemical exposures from the chemicals on the crops and things. This was back in the 70s and 80s. And I will say now most of my brothers and father who farm, they do almost all organic and a lot of non-GMO, so not glyphosate. So they're using less pesticides than they were. But back when I grew up, it was heavy pesticide. So all that to say, I'm 25 years old in the middle of medical school, and I find a lump in my breast. And I end up getting diagnosed with breast cancer, very aggressive breast cancer at 25 years old, which is kind of like the odds of winning the lottery. So that was kind of the start of becoming not only doctor, but patient, and going through that in medical school. How do I heal? How do I overcome this? And I ended up doing very conventional, aggressive chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. But in the same midst of that, I had, prayer, meditation, friends, nutrition, lifestyle, all these other things. So I actually got to live what I was trying to learn as the patient in the middle of medical training.
That must have been like a real sort of powerful motivator, I guess. At 25 to be diagnosed with that, you're like, what's going on? How can I heal myself?
Yeah, it really was, Ross. And the thing was, it was a very aggressive, as it is with many young people, like women who get breast cancer, typical age is 55, 60, and it's a little bit less aggressive. And especially 70s and 80s, it's almost always a very slow growing tumor. But if you take the 20, 30-year-old, which is actually number one, very rare, and number two, the type of cancer that grows in that 20-something-year-old body is very aggressive. So here I was, I would have loved to do natural treatments, but I was facing life sentence, like a death sentence. I was facing the mortality of potentially dying from this disease. So I ended up with the advice of the oncologist and the doctors doing very, very aggressive treatment in a conventional sense. And I always say the breast cancer was kind of easy to overcome. And it's been the last 20 years since that, really overcoming the side effects of that really toxic chemotherapy. Now, I don't have any regrets. So this isn't me saying, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I chose it. And I knew this is one of the lessons I give my followers and patients and people. When you're in the midst of a difficult decision, especially medically for your health, you have to take the best information you have at the time and make a decision and move forward. And I decided at that moment at 25, when I was facing that treatment decision, I'm going to do aggressive chemotherapy. And even if this causes lifelong side effects, which it did, I am never going to go back and say, what if I didn't do that? I'm never going to second guess myself. So I have never lived one moment in regret. I'm here living, But the downside was it really affected my gut. It affected my heart. It affected my immune system. And I'm still 20 plus years later living with the side effects of that toxic therapy.
Well, there's a couple of things, I guess, to dive into there. One thing that, as you were talking, made me think about the story at the start of your book, which is where you were talking about your rock climbing experience. And in this, you had this choice of like, whether to do it, whether to not. And we've always got to put our best foot forward and be the best version of ourselves, I guess. And in that moment, you had a choice, like, what do I do? Do I go down a conventional route or not? And yeah, you took that decision. I'm going to go all in and I'm not going to regret anything.
Yeah, I love to live that way. And I love to teach people to live that way because regret can be like a cancer. It can be just like a cancer if we have this regret of a relationship that failed and we're like, oh, what if I would have done this? Or what if I would have, right? That old phrase, or what if I would have done something differently? Or what if I would have chosen a different therapy? But that regret can literally eat away at us. And so I've learned to live my life in the moment as much as possible. And also, as you mentioned with rock climbing, challenging myself, pushing myself, doing things that are scary, not only scary, but I'll tell you what, Ross, terrifying. When I got on that, near me in Boulder, there's these huge flat irons, like thousands of foot up in the air. And that's where I started. I did my very first rock climb on this huge, huge, huge rock mountain. And it was terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. But some of the lessons I learned there were some of the most powerful lessons in my life. And they were this. Number one, I'm on solid rock, right? Like I'm actually on the solid place. So when we have a foundation of purpose and meaning and maybe greater, some spiritual belief, whatever that is for you, those things are our rock in our life that we kind of come back to, whether it's deep relationships, sense of greater purpose or meaning. And those rocks in our life are actually quite solid amidst the waves and the wind and all of that come about. So the lesson there was I'm on the solid rock. And if I can just remember that, it's actually quite safe. Number two, if I would look back behind me, thousands of foot down to the tiny trees and the tiny houses, it was absolutely like literally terrifying. So I had to stay present and focused and not look back. And that's kind of that regret thing in that if we look back and say, what if parts of our lives we would have done differently? You know what? The suffering, the difficulties, the broken relationships, those things end up being teachers. So I had to stay present. And number three was if I looked way, way up to the top, it was overwhelming in how far I had to go. So it just kept bringing me back to present. And one of the things I mentioned in the book, and I actually did, I literally sang to myself old hymns of my childhood because that kept me in the present state and it gave me courage.
Love that. And it's about that living in the moment, isn't it? Because if you dwell in the past for too long, then you can end up with low mood and depression. And if you look at the future too much, you end up with anxiety. What's going to happen?
Yeah.
If you can find a way to focus on the present moment, just be the best version of yourself, I guess we can't go too far wrong.
So true. And so much of health and vitality comes from just bringing ourselves, it's like reeling in the fish, right? Reeling ourselves back to the present moment. The present moment is where we have control. It's where we have like purpose and meaning and connection with human beings or a connection with nature or connection with whatever purpose or work that we're doing. If we're in the future, we can't do anything about it, right? And if we're in the past, we can't do anything about that either. So there's these things that are aligned at the studies of stress. There's an acronym called NUTS, novelty, something new and different. Unpredictability, that's the U, something that we don't know what's going to happen. T is threat to self or threat to health. And the last one is sense of control. And if we are in the future or we're in the past, we have no control over the novelty, unpredictability, threat to self, or sense of control. When we're in the present, we can control our mindset, our presence, our connection. So we actually have a lot more ability to deal with stress in the present moment as well.
I love that. Yeah, we can't control our nuts.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. Yes.
And you mentioned a few times, you said the rock is, your belief structure. It's what whether it's a belief in a higher power or religion or whatever it might be, or just your purpose. And you said something again at the start of the book, which I loved, which is your approach is evidence-based, or it could have been in the forward, evidence-based medicine grounded in love.
Yes.
I love that. I thought, what an eloquent way to look at medicine, because we've got the allopathic version on one hand, which is treat the symptoms, don't worry about the root cause.
Right.
But we can bring in so much more, and that seems to be what you're doing. I really like that.
Oh, thank you for noticing. Really, truly, from the moment a patient walks in my door or from the moment they call and get the receptionist at the front, my philosophy, and I train my staff, we just need to love people and show them this space where the optimal place of transformation can happen. And I've actually heard love literally described it that, whether it's a partner or a friend or a parent or a child, love is literally this space that we create for those that we love to be the optimal version of themselves. And I love that because it's so freeing. And it literally is not about us. It's not about us receiving love. It's not about us getting anything at all about that relationship or situation. It's about literally creating something for someone else to thrive. And when we can be in that mindset, like how much more of a healer is that than just here's a drug, here's a prescription, here's a referral. When I say, I am here creating a space for you, I want you to feel totally accepted and loved, no matter who you are, what your background is, what your symptoms are. And that space you literally metaphorically walk into in my office is this place where you know that you are totally and completely accepted and loved, and that my highest goal is your health and your personal transformation. And who wouldn't like thrive? And even our cells at that level, I think they feel that, and that's where healing starts.
Definitely. And you can hear the passion and the enthusiasm. And I can imagine being a patient in your office. And yeah, I guess having that self acceptance and that, okay, I can be me here and I can openly share. But I guess for many patients that you come across, they've been to see doctors before. They've been perhaps ignored something, or they've not listened to the symptoms. You know, I've personally been, so I've been on TRT and an NDT for 10 years, but I saw 5 doctors
Wow.
before I was eventually diagnosed. And I used to describe, I said, I feel like an antique toy robot. This was the best description I had.
That's
I said, I said, I want someone to put the key back in and wind me back up because I feel like I've got no wind left. I said, but I still want to be the best version I can be. I just got back from climbing Kilimanjaro when I was
Oh my
diagnosed.
goodness, amazing.
I can push through, but
Yeah.
I feel like this robot. And they just went, nah, there's nothing wrong with you. You know,
Oh,
you're 35, you're fit and healthy, you just climb the mountain, get out of here. And they just weren't listening. But I guess what you provide is a container where people can just open up and talk.
yeah, and part of it is just like I'll have people all the time in tears just because it's the first time a doctor listened and heard that, just like for you coming in there, if someone said, Ross, I hear you're really struggling. I mean, you're out there climbing mountains, but there's must be something else going on. And they sat with you and said, let's find the root cause. Like that's really, it's that partnership. It reminds me, I don't know if you know, I filmed a documentary last year as well. And part of that documentary, it follows the book and the story, but one of the scenes there is with my rock climbing mentor. So it was so interesting because the writing coach I had for my book was also a professional rock climber, and he's the one who took me climbing. And there's a scene of us sitting there where I had just climbed this, it was another area of rock climbing. And I got down, and you can see me on that climb in this spot where it was really difficult to find a foothold. And I'm like calling down to him below and saying, you know, what do I do, Topher? And he's like, just act like a child on the jungle gym. Just find your next foothold and your next foothold and your next foothold. And he talked me through it. And when I got down, we had this conversation. It was so profound and it was accidental. We had no script for this, but it was this. It was Topher. That's the name of my climb instructor. As I was up there, I knew you believed in me, and I could feel that you believed I could do this. Me on that rock, I had doubt. I was scared, and I was like, what is my next hold? I don't see any way out of this. There's nothing I could find to put my foot on. And down there below, Topher is like, no, Jill, do this. This is next. And he talked me through it. And his belief in me that I could overcome that challenge was what got me to the top. And then we got down and had this conversation at the bottom. And I said, Topher, I think sometimes that's how I am with patients. As I think sometimes like I can see the path forward and I can see the healing journey better than they can. And if I can bring that belief and they can almost borrow my belief in their wellness, then I can actually help them climb that mountain. And he just looked at me and said, of course. He said, Jill, that's exactly what you do to patients is you kind of loan them that belief. And I told him, I said, some patients will be like, you know, am I going to die of this? And obviously I'm not a predictor of the future, so I can't say for sure. But what I will always say is, no, there's a way, because I believe there's a way. And it's that belief in, so when someone else believes in you even greater than you believe in yourself, it's so powerful.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely is. I'm a physiotherapist by background. or a physical therapy, if
Yeah.
you guys call me over there in the States. And haven't treated anyone for many years, but a lot of my patients, when they came in, I'd provide that space for them to talk and talk about what's going on in their life. And I'd have my hands on them, but not really doing a great deal. And at the end, they go, "Oh, I feel great. That's amazing. Thank you." And I'm like, probably haven't done nothing other than just allow you to talk about what's going on in your life. But it's
True.
amazing. You give someone the opportunity.
Yeah. That's amazing. And what a great example, because you're right. It's like, it's funny. Just before this, I was at physical therapy and I had broke my wrist about 6 weeks ago and I'm rehabbing and it's doing great. But every morning I wake up and it's so stiff. And I feel like, oh my gosh, I lost all the progress I made last night, right? It's that whole cycle. I'm still getting strength back. And I told her, I shared this and I said, will I ever get back to my normal strength and my grip? And of course, she just loaned me that belief. Oh, of course, Jill, you're doing great. Your range of motion is amazing. You can totally get that, right? And I went away. I just got back from there just moments before I started this podcast. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be fine, right? I love that.
I can imagine that. She's going, it's only 6 weeks,
Yeah.
it's a little bit 6 to go. Like, keep going.
Yeah. And so even for me, she loaned me that today. And now I feel really good. I'm like, okay, I'll be fine. That's great.
I love that. And I think the reason we're on the planet, and you touched on it with the rock climbing and with many things in your book, I think the reason we're here is to become the best version of ourselves. Whether it's a rock climber, whether it's a doctor, whether it's a husband, a father, a mother, whatever. I think that's why we're here, and that's one of the messages I got that came through your book as well.
Oh, so true. I am, if there's one sole purpose in life, it's personal transformation, every day becoming a better version of myself and helping those that I love, those that are in my life, my patients, my friends, my family, also achieve their greatness. Because if there's one gift, it's a gift and a curse, but I'll call it a gift for the moment that I have, is seeing the potential in another human being. Now, that has gotten me into some really bad, unhealthy romantic relationships because I'm like, I see his potential, right? And then I'm like, oh, that's not going to change and I can't change this. But on the other hand, that gift is that, like, literally patients or people that are in my life, I always see this, like, it's like I can see the soul level of someone and I want to call them out to what the potential is. And be that cheerleader and that person in their life, just encouraging them to keep being the best version of themselves.
Yeah, we sound really similar there. Again, I always see the best in people. My wife's like, "You're too nice. You should be more cynical." I don't want to be. Like, I want to see the best in everybody.
Me too. I would rather be illusioned and disappointed and continue to see the best than to be a pessimist or a critic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Where do you sit on the sort of intuition side of things? Because again, I might get this wrong, but I'm thinking there was a story about a nun in your book.
Oh, yes. Okay. So I'll tell that in 1 second and I'll just frame it because I grew up in a family of farmers, but also engineers. Like, they are really high analytical, German, Swiss. All my brothers are engineering, education, and they bring that even to the farming. And they're really analytical thinkers, and I'm like that. And it's funny, when we grew up in a family, we kind of think that that's just who we are. So I went to bioengineering undergrad and then medical school, and very much like an analytical thinker. And there's a way in which we almost use our analytical mind to disassociate from our body. And I did that for many years. And that's, I think, why I dealt with so much illness, because I was always in my head. I loved my head. I loved thinking, loved problem solving from there. But unless we connect to the heart and the body, that's where the healing really happens. And this goes back to your question about intuition, in that I was all about the science, right? I love the science. And I definitely had a strong faith and belief in a higher power, but I was like trying to figure out how to bring these two together. Because in medical school, it's taught you trust the science, the labs. There's no place for intuition. There's no place for faith. There's no place for miracles. That is non-existent. So I learned to push that aside, which was actually this deep, strong, profound part of myself, and trust just the mind. But then, as you'll see, there's studies out there, there's many doctors out there, but any of us who are in this field long enough, we realize there's this intuitive sense that comes from experience over time and pattern recognition. And then it integrates into our subconscious, and we can look at a patient and have this sense intuitively within seconds, because the subconscious processes millions of parts of data within literally microseconds, versus the analytical is like the old computer here, takes a lot longer. So, but as we start to trust that and believe that there's power in our intuitive sense, again, it comes from wisdom over time and seeing patterns. there's this really, really strong power of the intuitive sense to actually make good decisions, to guide healing pathways, and to actually make clinical decisions as a doctor. And then you use the analytical mind to prove it with the labs and stuff. But that's the framework I started to realize, oh, there is value not only in the science and the analytical left brain, but there is powerful value in the heart, in the intuition, in this other part of the brain that maybe doesn't have all the randomized controlled trials, right? It's like the two of them. And back to the story. So I was flying to Peoria, where my parents live, and I was on a tiny little plane from Chicago to Peoria, and I saw these two sisters in habits, two nuns, and I just was really drawn because their faces were just bright and full of love and laughter, and I was so drawn to that, and I kept thinking I should maybe say something, and instead on the little plane ride, I'm coloring a little picture. I had in my purse a little coloring book, and I had this intuitive sense in my mind, and it was almost audible that just give the picture to the nuns. And I literally sat there and argued because I thought, this is so stupid. I don't know them. They don't know me. Who am I to color a picture and give it to them? Like I thought, what? Or my analytical mind was like, this is ridiculous, Jill. You're too old for this, right? I was in my 30s or 40s. But my heart, my intuitive sense was like, give the picture to the nuns. And I couldn't ignore it. And by the time the plane was just about to land, I was like, took this deep breath. I turned, she's like right back behind here. And I said, hi, I'm Jill, and I just colored you a picture. Like it was the most silly thing. It was like a 5-year-old would say, but you know what happened, Ross, out of that was magic. And it was because my intuitive sense, I listened, and there was something there that was deeper than my logical sense that I overcame. We started laughing and talking, and she was teaching at Montessori schools, and we talked about travel and the difficulties because I was at that time teaching and traveling. And it was just the most joyful, beautiful conversation. And she said, let me write down your name. I would love to pray for you. And thank you so much. And the little picture I'd given her was a girl on a bicycle that was like traveling and doing a lot. And it was like, the message was, God will take care of you in your travels. And she was just, you could tell she like cherished this beautiful message. And it was interesting because we would think like these holy sisters are so beautiful and godly, and they were, but like what I realized is they're human too, right? Like she was struggling with all the travel and the lack of good beds and food and all that. And so was I. And on this human level, we connected so deeply. And then as we're walking off into the lobby to get our luggage, my parents were about to meet me, and I'm flanked on two sides by these beautiful nuns, and everybody's like, wow. And the neatest thing was, I said, well, she asked me what I did as we're leaving. So, well, you probably haven't heard of it, because functional medicine is, so I tell her face lit up, and she said, oh, right by the place where we live, there is a functional medicine doctor I've been seeing, and I've been looking for someone. So bottom line is we exchanged numbers, and later, about a year later, I get an email. I don't know if you remember me. This is Sister Mary Rose, but we met on a plane, and I'm like, of course I remember you. And it ended up, she became a patient, and I've been able to help her with, and of course, from my part, she prays for me, and I'm so grateful for that. So it was just a beautiful thing, this magical moment. And I had to listen to that intuitive sense and kind of argue with the logical part that said, this is stupid. This is childish. And when I acted, this little miracle happened.
I absolutely love that. And I could talk about intuition and the spiritual side of medicine forever, but it's probably a good time to get more into what you do as the doctor, I guess. And what kind of patients do come and see you? What kind of ailments do you help them with on a daily basis?
Yeah, so one of my colleagues says, I'm a resort doctor. I'm the doctor of last resort. So then these patients have been other places and things. And all that to say, I end up seeing the complex, chronic, kind of mysterious illnesses. Now, from my perspective, it's functional medicine, which is root cause medicine, trying to go to the deep levels of biochemistry, physiology, and say what actually changed in the physiology, in the biochemistry, in the hormones, in the neurotransmitters, in whatever pathways in the body. What went wrong on this trajectory to lead you to this illness or this set of symptoms? And then how do we reverse that trajectory and go backwards? And that's the core of functional medicine. So it works really well with complex, chronic, mysterious things. And I love a challenge. So those are the kind of patients I love to see. At the core, though, usually it's toxic load and infectious burden. It's like these two things that are coming together to create inflammation, dysfunction, autoimmunity. And so if we go down to that level, often we'll find there's been chemical exposures, there's been mold exposures, there's been heavy metals or other toxic chemicals in the environment. And this could be from inside too. If you have an overgrowth of bacteria in your gut or something going on in your body that's creating inflammation or overload. And then on the other side is infectious burden. A lot of people walk around and they were maybe bit by a tick or spider or something as a kid and got some infection that was dormant and not bothering them. And then in their 30s or 40s, stress, immune issues, whatever else started happening and weakened that immune system. And then all of a sudden, this thing like Lyme disease or Bartonella or Epstein-Barr virus starts to pop up. Now, we've seen that really escalate since the pandemic because COVID is an immunosuppressive virus. So often people post-COVID for several months will see these old infections start to pop up and become an issue as well, because that's all part of that weakening immune system.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So you must have been really busy then over the last couple of years.
Very much. Yes. Yes.
That pandemic thing definitely changed things a little.
Yeah.
So what you meant one thing that from your book again was the whole idea of mold being this toxin, and I hadn't really come across that. And the other element, of course, is you mentioned the pesticides, the herbicides, the endocrine disrupting chemicals, which I'm more familiar with. But does either one of those figure more often in your patients, or is it equal?
Yeah, so really at the core of whether it's fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, unexplained headaches, or body pain, or brain dysfunction, or autoimmunity, often, like I said, toxic exposure, infectious burden. And so at the core of some of the most complex chronic diseases, we do see mold. So let's talk just a little bit about that, because many people are like, well, I have mildew in my shower. Is it really that big a deal? First of all, there's a percentage of people that genetically are more predisposed to react to mold. And in medical school, we're taught mold is an allergen, which is true. We can have asthma, allergies, reactivity, histamine-based from mold, and that's absolutely true. And I would say more people than not are allergic or sensitive to mold in that case. But there's this whole other part of the immune system called the innate immune system. And this is where, again, we saw this during COVID because COVID wasn't so bad as a virus, but what it did is it activated the cytokines and immune inflammation. And many people who either died or got very ill from COVID was because of that cytokine inflammatory storm. Same thing can happen with mold. So mold can trigger through the production of mycotoxins. When we inhale those are smaller than 2.5 microns, which means they just go directly into our alveoli, into our bloodstream within seconds of inhaling. So say we walk into a moldy old theater, within 5 seconds of inhaling that air that contains the mycotoxins, which is the production product to protect the mold species, and these are a very small particulate, into our lungs, into our bloodstream within seconds. And then that's a toxin in our blood that for some people can start to trigger an immune inflammation or reaction. And then these things we call cytokines, which is our own immune protection, start to be produced in our body and create things like muscle soreness, brain fog, mood disorders, autoimmunity, joint pain, and a number of other things. So mold often is a trigger of the innate immune system. It's often a trigger of mast cell activation, which is a whole nother arm of the immune system that can cause allergies, rashes, leaky gut, leaky brain, you name it, many tachycardia, heart symptoms. And so this whole conglomeration of mold for some people can affect them in a really profound way. And because it's invisible, they're in this home or in a theater or in some sort of a building, they're like, they just don't feel well, but they don't always place where it is. And very frequently, if it's your home, of course, you spend sleeping time there and all those hours that you spend there. And over time, often the story is someone moved to a new home or a new, not necessarily even new build, but some sort of a new location. And within 6 months to a year of moving there, they started to decline in their health. So that's always a clue that mold could be a problem. But here's the other thing, as I alluded to in the beginning, many times other family members are not affected or not affected to the same extent. So it can be very confusing because the mother and the son might be incredibly ill after moving into this house, and the daughter and the father are perfectly fine. So it affects people differently. And it's because some people are reactive on the innate immune system level. And like I said, the tricky thing is you don't usually see it. It could be like this beautiful wall behind me that looks just perfectly fine. In that wall, there'd been a water leak from the ceiling or from the attic and then went into that wall, and there might be massive mold growing there, but I don't see it. I just know I don't feel so well. So it can be very mysterious to figure out where is the source. And the bottom line of mold healing, and we could talk a little bit about that if you'd like, is you have to have a decently low exposure, meaning if you are living in a toxic moldy home, there's probably no amount of supplements or IVs or nutrition that's going to get you well if you continue to be exposed. So the number one rule is you have to limit or get out of that exposure.
How do you, if you can't see it, how do you find it to get
Yes.
rid of it?
This is a really difficult thing, and it's interesting because I'm a doctor, not an environmental specialist, but I've had to become somewhat educated in how to guide the patients to get the right inspectors, the right remediators, and people. So often we'll start with a simple dust test. So you can test the dust in your home with a Q qualitative PCR, that's polymerase chain reaction, which tests for DNA in the dust of the mold. So literally you're testing the dust of your home to see if there's DNA of mold living in that dust. Mold and mycotoxins like to hitch a ride on dust. So if you have a pristine, incredibly clean home, even if you have mold, you're less likely to have reactions. So that's one little tip. But if you do have this mold producing toxins, it's going to accumulate. So you can actually measure kind of a historical fingerprint of your home. And I will look at those tests with patients. And if I see some of the really nasty molds like Stachybotrys and Cotomium in that dust sample at high levels, I'm like, oh, there's likely a problem somewhere in your house. Then you need an inspector to come and look at the common sources. But even if you're not an expert, you can look under sinks, look for water damage and modeling of wood. You can look at floorboards if they start to, lift up. You can look behind the fridge. So fridge, sinks, bathrooms. You can look for the mold growing in the grout. Anything where you might see a sign of previous water damage in a porous material like wood or drywall is a likely source of mold.
Wow. I'm going to go and check later.
I
I'll get around my house with a little
Right.
magic glass. So what about sort of the endocrine disruption chemicals then? So there's mold on the one hand, and now we've got a bit of an idea about how we might locate it. I guess we'll come back to how to treat it. But what if someone has been exposed to EDCs? How does that present? Is it similar? Is it different? How do you diagnose that?
Yeah, so a lot of the pesticides, this is why my story growing up on a farm was relevant, because a lot of the pesticides and herbicides we use on crops, at least still in the US, in Europe, you guys are much better at banning the really toxic chemicals, and a lot of them we still use. One, for example, is atrazine. Atrazine is a known endocrine disruptor. There were studies of frogs that were living in runoff, and they became basically ambiguous genitalia. You couldn't tell if they were male or female because they had such a confused endocrine system from the runoff of atrazine. And this is still used in like central Illinois, where I grew up, on corn and soybeans. And this is a really toxic endocrine disruptor. So what does that mean? Endocrine disruptor means that it alters the hormones of both males and females. One of the common things, and this is interesting because mold will do this as well, is it can upregulate an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase will take testosterone from men and women and turn it into estrogen. So all of a sudden men will have man boobs and have low libido and weight gain around the middle. Women will have really heavy, painful periods, breast tenderness, maybe even breast cyst or uterine abnormalities like fibroids, or even breast cancer or prostate cancer. So at the extremes, this can even induce cancers. And these endocrine disruptors are literally not only in the chemicals like pesticides, but they're in phthalates and parabens, which in most non-organic bath and body products for male and female, the washes, the perfumes, the makeup, many of these have parabens and phthalates, and these are literally endocrine disruptors to our system.
So they're quite literally everywhere.
Yes, they really are. And this is why you see young women going through, like starting their period earlier and earlier and earlier. It used to be like the average, maybe 12 to 14 years old, now 8 or 9 or even younger women. And that's because of that endocrine-like effect on a young woman's body. You see way more incidence of breast cancer. When I was diagnosed in 2001, which is quite a long time ago, I was one of the first diagnosed at that age at Loyola, where I went to medical school. Now there are literally hundreds of 16, 17, 18, 20 something young females with breast cancer, which was unheard of just 20 years ago.
Wow. It seems that, from one respect, the world has leapt forward technologically over the last 100 years. We're advanced in so many ways, and yet we're becoming iller and sicker in almost every way. Obesity is on the rise, cardiovascular is on the rise, cancer's getting worse. Like, it surely has to be because of the environment.
You hit the nail on the head, Ross, because that is literally, I always say that's the elephant in the room in medicine. And this is the environmental toxic load. We are all swimming in toxic soup, whether it's parabens, phthalates, organophosphates, Roundup or glyphosate, or PFAs. This is the new thing in my state of Colorado. They recently tested all the main water body supplies, and they found PFAs. These are polyfluorinated compounds. They also go by names like Teflon and Gore-Tex. So your camping gear, your rain gear, all of your hiking gear for Kilimanjaro probably was all like coated with this basically waterproofing. And if you're getting takeout food, it will be coated with a thing that'll prevent the oil from going into the cardboard. That's all. Cans are lined with this. So it's everywhere. Popcorn bags in the microwave. All of these things are lined with this PFAs. And it's now getting in our water supply. And like I said, in Colorado last year, they tested, and every single body of water they tested, even including drinking water, was above the legal limits. So it's there. Now, here's the bad thing, Ross. These are called forever chemicals. And what that means is scientists they're not even able to calculate the half-life. Half-life is like in 50 years, so half of this will still be there. They can't even calculate that. So if it's already in our water supply, there's no going back. This is contaminated. This is in our water supply, at least in the US, at least in my state of Colorado. So what can we do, right? Because that's the depressing thing. We can filter, but that's where I always say clean air, clean water, clean food. You start with the basics. You don't need a lot of expensive supplements, but you start with making sure your water that you're drinking is filtered and clean and free of toxins, chemicals, PFAs, medications, all of that. So if you're not drinking filtered water, you need to be. That's where you start.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess, is that where your treatment starts then? So it's that clean air, clean water, clean food.
Yeah, I always start with it because, again, supplements and all these other protocols are great. But if you're not having the inputs into your body, the very basics, clean air, let's start there, because what people don't realize, this is kind of relevant to the mold conversation. 80% of the air that we breathe is our toxic load. So people all the time are walking around, whether you're by a busy highway or an airport or you have mold in your home, much of the invisible insult on our system is the air that we breathe. So once again, I'm a huge fan of getting people a good quality air filter, at the very least in your bedroom, something with a HEPA filtration, which is the larger particulate like dust and pollens, but also with a VOC, volatile organic compound filter. Usually that means that the inside of the air filter will have either carbon, charcoal, or zeolite, which kind of absorbs those toxins like formaldehyde and smoke and nanoparticulate. So that's where you start, is getting a good air filtration system in your house or just buying a standalone unit for your bedroom. Clean water, we talked a little bit about. You should be filtering your water at least at home. And I don't ever drink tap water if I can avoid it. Even going to hotels, I have a water bottle that's portable with a filter inside. So if I'm traveling, I can filter water anywhere that I go. And then clean food. This is maybe a little bit more complex, but at the very least, trying to eat as much as you can organic, free of glyphosate, free of chemicals, free of pesticides. If you can, get local farmers, locally grown, in season is ideal, non-GMO, all of those things. And then avoiding some of the really toxic foods like refined sugar and farmed salmon, some of these things that are really toxic.
Yeah, love that. So get the basics right.
Yeah.
And then depending on what happens from there, I guess you can tweak things.
Yeah. So again, those inputs are so important, because if you're swimming in toxic soup, if you're in a moldy home, if you're drinking toxic water or eating horrible food, I always feel like there's no amount of, or why waste your money on supplements or protocols that are expensive, even the doctor, unless you're doing those basics. And you can do that without a physician. You can start to do those things at home. So a lot of what I teach is how to live well, how to incorporate habits that keep you healthy. One of my habits is every night I take an Epsom salt bath. Epsom salts are by nature will allow magnesium sulfate to go into your body through the skin. And that's a wonderful detoxifying. It's a calming thing. It helps for sleep. So that's a great starting point. But teaching patients that, because then the next step is maybe medications, maybe supplements, maybe protocols, maybe IVs. There's a lot more that we can do, but the foundation is so critical.
Yeah, I love that. And are there any more, what's the right way of saying it, sort of well-used protocols that you come across? Obviously, we're all different. We're all bio-individual. I'm not suggesting anyone that gets a cookie cutter solution, but are there some things that you find more helpful than others?
Yeah, so at the very basic, I'm looking at nutrients, and I want patients to have For example, an apple today contains about 1/5 of the magnesium as it did 50 years ago. So even if we're eating local, organic, beautiful magnesium, our soils are so depleted now that many times, even in a good, healthy diet, we're not getting the nutrients we need. So I'm a big fan of supplementation, starting with the basics: minerals, B vitamins, vitamin D, sunshine if possible, some of those basics. And then detox is so huge because we're all swimming in toxic soup. So I'll often add things like glutathione, or if a patient can't tolerate that, precursors like N-acetylcysteine, lipoic acid, milk thistle, glycine, glutamine. These are all precursors of glutathione, vitamin C, and immune supportive. Frequently, as I mentioned with the milk thistle, I'll be doing some liver support just to help aid that detoxification. And often binders, if there is mold exposure, things like clay or charcoal, glycomannins, chlorella, you can take orally, and these things can bind some of the toxins that we get exposed to. That's kind of the supplement regimen. And I'm a huge fan of other things that help our body perform optimally. So I like I said, Epsom salt baths, infrared sauna. Things like cold plunge can stimulate lymphatics and improve norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, and production of nitric oxide, which helps our blood flow, helps our heart, lung, sexual function, all those organs that need blood flow. I'm a big fan of PEMF, pulsed electromagnetic therapy. In fact, right here next to me, that's my mat. So I use that almost every day and every night, and it has a magnetic field that creates for increased blood flow, increased healing. The studies around that from NASA are pretty powerful for brain, for cognitive rehab, for healing bones injuries, for healing just rehab in general, for sleep. So I use that all the time. Walking, moving, exercise, obviously key, connection with friends and family. And I could name 101 other things, but actually these lifestyle things are pretty powerful as well.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned something interesting, which was the nitric oxide. Where do you sit on the whole methylene blue thing?
Ooh,
Because that seems to have come out of nowhere. Everyone's squirting it in their mouth, and that inhibits nitric oxide.
okay, I
Is that
love
right?
that we're talking about this. Yes, you are correct, Ross. You've done your homework. Amazing. So methylene blue, first let's talk, because when I first saw this out there, I was like, this is an industrial dye. Like, this is a toxic chemical, right? Like you would think. Well, the truth is, back in the 1800s, before they ever had antibiotics, they started using this and somehow accidentally found out it was amazing for parasitic infections like malaria, babesia, some other infections, and it was really powerful. And then they also found out that people who had like septic shock after surgery, or really bad infections in the hospital, they would literally use it as an IV antibiotic, and it was so powerful. And then they started researching and realizing it was a mitochondrial redox inhibitor. So what it would do is damage the mitochondria, which is our little organelles inside each cell that create energy, create ATP, can be damaged by toxin, by chemical, by chemotherapy, by any number of things. You could name any stressor in our environment or body and probably could damage mitochondria. So this actually, methylene blue can also rehab damaged mitochondria. And that's another power thing. So all these crazy things that are happening. And when I really started studying and reading about it, I saw these studies on someone who is in cardiovascular shock, like say after surgery, after a severe infection, their whole system would collapse and their blood pressure would drop. And these are kinds of, like, sepsis is a good example in the hospital, where someone's infected by a bacteria and they literally could die because their whole system collapses from that infection. So I started to think about this. Okay, this is interesting. How would that possibly help that? Well, what it does is, when there's an infectious or toxic insult, there's this ENOS pathway that produces nitric oxide, but sometimes it produces too much. And that can cause this vasodilation, collapse of our circulatory system, drop in blood pressure. And that's literally what happens in sepsis. So I started to think, and the relevance is, yes, if you are a very, very poor nitric oxide producer, you might want to use caution on when you use methylene blue. But on the other side of this, what I've been seeing post-pandemic is a lot of people with POTS, dysautonomia, and issues with adrenal function. And all of those, POTS is postural orthostatic tachycardia. You stand up, your blood pressure drops, and you either feel dizzy, lightheaded, or you have heart racing. And the reason for this is you have this vasodilation of the lower extremities, this pooling of blood, and you can't get that preload back to the heart. So the heart can't pump, and then you have the heart trying to increase rate to compensate. And this whole thing cascades and can cause people to literally be disabled or in bed. They can't hardly do. And it goes along with that dysautonomia. Dysautonomia just means that the autonomic system that controls blood pressure, heart rate, all of those, breath, is not functioning. And post-pandemic, we've seen a lot of this. So I had a little bit of this myself after COVID. And so, I wonder if methylene blue could help. It has been a game changer in those patients because it'll actually help keep their blood pressure more regulated. So in those patients where they're having too much nitric oxide production, too much vascular collapse, drop in blood pressure, it is literally, I've had patients who've been in bed for 5 years, disabled. They're up and walking and doing well. And of course, it's a mitochondrial rehab. And then on the other side of that, these infections that can pop up like Bartonella, Babesia, Borrelia, it is antibiotics. So it has a profound effect. And what I saw is years ago, I was using methylene blue at high doses for infections like Bartonella, but people would have side effects above 50 milligrams. So in this latest, as I've been using it personally and for patients, I've been using really tiny doses, and I find there's almost no side effects, no interactions, and people are feeling brain cognition come back online, blood pressure come back online. So it's a very fascinating thing. But on that other side, if someone was hypertensive, so they were having really high blood pressures, that's a first sign of nitric oxide deficiency. Those are the kind of patients I probably would not use methylene blue for.
Brilliant. That was a fantastic answer. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would love the viewers to know?
Oh, great question. So we have talked about mold and toxins and how to overcome anything and how to be an encourager, how to have a motive and purpose in your life. We've covered the gamut. I think the one thing that would be important that we haven't touched on is so often people are walking around with chronic illness or issues, and they can go to a functional doctor and figure out the microbiome of the gut or the mold issues or the toxic environmental issues. But in my own personal journey, one of the most powerful healers is how do you feel safe in your body? Because if you don't feel safe from past trauma, from any sort of thing that we've ever dealt with in our lives, there's no amount of vitamin supplements or even positive thinking that will overcome that. So one of the latest things I've really been dealing with in patients is how do you deal with micro and macro traumas? And yes, there can be some people out there who've been in horribly abusive relationships or childhoods, but many of us had a great childhood and a great environment, but we still have micro traumas and we still have ways that we feel like we're not enough or we're not safe, and dealing with those on that level. And there's so many programs out there that are online now that can deal with trauma is so powerful. And if you want a place to start, read Gabor Mate, Myth of Normal. There's a Besser van der Kolk is another one. There's all these writers that are experts, more expert than me, but I feel like dealing with those traumas to create a safe environment for our body to thrive in is the last frontier that we're starting to talk about.
Love that. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. Do you work with people only in person, or can people contact you for telemedicine as well?
We do both. Yes.
Brilliant. And if someone is watching this and they're like, Jill sounds amazing, I've got to work with her, how do they find you?
Thank you, Ross. Well, my main site is jillcarnahan.com. There is literally decades of blogs and podcasts and so much free information. If you don't ever even have to see me, and you can get lots and lots and lots of stuff there all for free. So go there. And I do want to mention our movie's coming out this month. So you can actually finally see it's drpatientmovie.com. And I think that'll be a big game changer because it's really following the journey of patients that have healed and myself, and hopefully an encouragement to those listening.
Fantastic. And the book, of course, is called Unexpected.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I shall let you get back to your day, but it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
You too, Ross. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Alphagenix podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss next week's episode. For more resources on Alphagenix and men's health, visit alphagenix.co.uk. Until next time.